All right, welcome everyone. It's practice night at Orlando Stoics, and today we are going through the material in chapter 2 of Donald Robertson's book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. It talks about the early life of Marcus Aurelius and the influences on him. The material is really interesting because he does tie it to some of the things that we talk about in modern Stoicism. And also, by the way, Donald must really research his books well, because I was able to confirm some of the people and the influences in other sources like the IEP, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and Britannica's Encyclopedia. So with that, Joe, let's get started with where the book starts. It talks about the Sophists very early on, and how at the time that Marcus was a young adult, the Sophists were kind of like a cottage industry, you might call it today. They were influential teachers. They were getting paid for their work. And yet there was another side to it, that maybe the Sophists liked their work a little bit too much and had some vanity associated with it. What did you think about that part of the chapter?
Yeah, I actually think that it really calls out the contrast between the Sophists and the Stoics right away. The importance of understanding that the Sophists were very much like academics today and not necessarily focused on the practical aspects of wisdom. He also gets into the fact that how the appearance of wisdom and how the theory and being right is more important than actually being right and acting right. So that is a really important distinction to make, because you can see the difference in how Hadrian would act and how Marcus would act as a Stoic. So I think there's an interesting parallel between those two.
And the Sophists, for those of you who are into the history of philosophy, keep in mind the Sophists go back like 700 years before Marcus. That's when they started, with famous characters like Thrasymachus and Protagoras, these names that we sometimes hear, but we don't remember exactly who they were. They were some of the practicing Sophists in the early days. And it just had kind of a resurgence in the early Roman Empire.
It's also interesting to see how these things are still relevant today, how people often are more worried about being perceived as being right as opposed to actually doing the right thing. And you kind of see that all across the political spectrum or within the business world and our everyday life. So this is what I like about this book in particular, is that it is still relevant to our everyday life. We still see some of the problems that existed back in the day, Marcus's day, still exist today. And it's, we're no more wise in some ways.
Yeah, thus we have the term virtue signaling.
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
Isn't that amazing?
Exactly. That is true.
Comes right around in history. Yeah. Okay. Well, also, let's go to another interesting part of the chapter, which is where the Emperor Hadrian had an argument with one of the Sophists. This Sophist has a difficult name. It's like Flavorinus or something like that. A guy that I hadn't heard much about, but in the end, the Sophist, who may have been right, had to give in to Hadrian and say, he said some line like, why am I going to argue with a guy who controls 30 legions of soldiers?
But, and you see, though, how that eventually, we'll see as the chapter goes on, that actually represents how Hadrian would end up ruling, like a tyrant. And it's those little things that you see early on that he had to be right, even though he could possibly be wrong. The lack of humility that he had, even in the smallest of conversations, ended up impacting the way he actually ruled, and like a tyrant. And I thought that that's very interesting, because I always feel like you can tell by the small things that people do more than the big things. And if somebody is, would hold vendettas against someone for maybe outwitting them in an argument, you know there's probably an issue. So I thought that
Now,
that was fascinating.
right. And you know, the flow of the chapter, the next place it goes is a very interesting thing. It talks about Epictetus and his views for, that is, in comparison to the Sophists, who sometimes did seek vanity or seeking the praise of an audience. But Epictetus makes a point that we should stick to the practical side of philosophy and benefit from it that way. And so Epictetus often talked about these practical things and even gave that, what's that metaphor? Oh, the metaphor about the doctor, that you should expect that there will be, when you go to the doctor's office, you will have some discomfort. There may be some pain rather than pleasure. And so that's really a nice contrast between the pleasure-seeking sophists, that is, some of them, you know, seeking the audience reaction or the vanity of it. So yeah, that's an interesting comparison with Epictetus's view. How did you see that, Joe?
No, that's an interesting perspective. The idea that you're also seeking pleasure as a way of when you receive this affirmation. One of my favorite lines in the chapter was the difference between a sophist and a stoic. The former speaks to win praise from his audience, the latter to improve them by helping them to achieve wisdom through virtue. And I think that this is really kind of an important point here, is that when you're seeking praise first, that your actions are not necessarily going to end up being, shall we say, just. But if you seek virtue first, then not only are your actions just, but you also have a certain tranquility that comes along with that.
The next part of the life of Marcus that is shown is some of the benefits that he got from Stoicism. You know, sometimes we look back on a figure in history like Marcus Aurelius, emperor, wealth, power, lives in a palace, you know, things like that. We think, wow, that life must be great. I wish I could try that. But Marcus, as he was coming to power, he was very disturbed, or what you might say, upset in his own way with the court system and with the corruption that was going on in Roman society at the time. And it's Donald Robertson makes a point that Marcus dealt with those bad feelings by using coping mechanisms that Stoicism offered. And it wasn't just coping with that part of society that he viewed as bad, but also it helped him deal with money very effectively. Marcus did not have much attachment to wealth. He often gave it away. And also in terms of gratitude, he was very, remember how book 1 starts in Meditations, he was very grateful for all of the people in his life, even an unnamed slave who he mentions very prominently over some of his other famous teachers. So he's showing these things, coping and non-attachment, and then with the gratitude, all of these things, Stoicism helped him put into practice and helped him live better. What do you think, Joe?
And it really, as you mentioned, it showed in his actions. You know, when he was going to war, he was willing to sell the palace's treasures in order to pay for the war. He wasn't attached to what his own belongings. He looked at them as just that. They're material things that could be discarded. He often also, I really like the part where Dionysus, who really taught him not to waste time, or, you know, gave him a lot of formation in the sense of how to best use his time and how to address other people. I think that that's a really important point, not to believe in some of these superstitions and to let his mind wander and to stay rational when he's making his decisions. And I think that this had a really big impact on him when he was dealing with senators and how he dealt with the Senate versus how Hadrian.
And taking that a step further, I think he was quite influenced by Antoninus, the emperor who came before him.
Yes.
We need to remember the placement in history is that Marcus Aurelius is 161 to 180. Aren't those the years? I think like 19 or so years. But prior to him, the emperor who ended his reign in 161, that was Antoninus, who was also known as a someone who was calm and rational. I think that could have had an influence on Marcus Aurelius as well, because he was kind of watching. Look at this, how this guy takes his time, making decisions, using reason.
And sticking to his principles. That was another part about it that was very important that I'd taken away from it. And also the Apollonius, how he taught Marcus as well, integrating philosophy into his daily life, also I thought was a really important part. I just wanted to mention that as well. It's a little bit off where we were going, but I just remembered that, and I thought that was a really important part because it really, he was really, in both chapters, you kind of see where Marcus really makes the distinction of how to you achieve resilience by seeking virtue. And that's actually something that you see on a regular basis with him in this chapter and in the previous chapter.
And as we get to the middle of the chapter, because remember, this week we're only reviewing the first half of chapter 2. I'm glad that Donald Robertson put in something that relates to modern Stoicism very, very much. It's the Protopassions, as he calls it, and how Seneca helps us understand the phases of the Protopassions and how we can manage our passions better. There's a great example that Donald uses in this book about imagine if you're in a sinking boat and your first impulse is, I'm in a sinking boat. Oh no. And then the second result might be a judgment based on that, like, I'm going to die or I'm going to, perish here. And then the third level is just more judgments built upon those things. But this is a great example of how even today in the modern era, we're, we think of ourselves as modern and advanced, and yet we can get so ruffled by something new that happens. And it's amazing how this applies to modern day.
Yeah, and it really showed how quickly we can lose our wits about ourselves in very difficult situations, and we're no longer acting rational. And if we actually take a step back and have a process for dealing with these types of situations, that we'll have a much more healthier response. And I really like the Seneca on anger passage or framework that he provided us with.
Yeah, Seneca on anger. That's one of the books that is even available on the internet as a public domain book. I know that it's, I've got a link to one of the sources on my StoicDan.com website. You can check that out. But thanks everyone for watching today, and stay tuned to this channel if you want more videos like this.
Subscribe to this channel to hear about new videos. Follow us on social media for more info. Visit StoicDan.com.